She didn't scream. That was the thing nobody expected. When Lady Victoria Caldwell deliberately knocked the full bucket of soapy water across Evelyn Hartwell's back in front of 3 housemaids, 2 footmen, and Nathaniel Ashford himself, the servant girl on her knees, simply stopped moving. She didn't gasp, she didn't cry, she didn't beg. She lifted her face slowly, the way a person lifts their face into cold wind, not flinching. Just meeting it, and she looked directly at the woman who had just humiliated her. Nobody in that hallway breathed, because that look said everything a woman wasn't allowed to say out loud. If that kind of quiet courage moves something in you, subscribe to this channel and follow Evelyn's story all the way to the end. Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The wagon dropped her at the iron gates without slowing down much. Just enough for Evelyn Hartwell to step off with her suitcase rope-tied shut because the latch had broken 2 winters ago, and then the driver flicked his reins and moved on without a word. She stood at those gates alone. The wind off the Colorado high country hit her straight in the face. October wind, the kind that doesn't apologize. She wore a coat that had been mended so many times it had forgotten its original shape. Her boots were cracked along the left sole. In her right hand, the suitcase, pressed against her ribs with her left arm, invisible to anyone watching, a small cloth pouch. Inside it, a gold locket so fine it looked spun rather than made. She didn't open the pouch, she just held it. Then she straightened her spine slow. Deliberate, the kind of straightening that comes from somewhere deeper than posture, and walked through those like she had every right in the world to be there. The housekeeper who met her at the servants' entrance looked her over the way a woman looks at a horse she's not sure she wants to stable. "Evelyn Hartwell," she said. "A verdict." "Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Doyle. I run this house below stairs." She didn't offer her hand. "You applied for the mending position. No references from the past 3 years." "No." "Ma'am, I was caring for my father. He passed in August. We don't trade in sympathy here, Miss—" Doyle turned and walked. $6 a month, 1 midday meal. East Servants' Quarters, shared room. You're available whenever you're needed. Day or night. Understood? Evelyn followed her. Understood. Your work is unsatisfactory. You're gone without notice. Understood, Mrs. Doyle stopped at the bottom of a narrow staircase and looked back at her. Something shifted in the older woman's face, not warmth. Not even close, but something that wasn't entirely cold either. "You speak well," she said. "Better than that coat suggests. My father believed education was the one thing poverty couldn't take from a person," Evelyn said. Mrs. Doyle studied her for one more moment. Then she turned and climbed the stairs. The room was narrow and cold. The east wing of Ashford Hall was the oldest part of the building, and the heat barely reached it. Evelyn's cot had a hollow worn into the center of the mattress. The window above her looked out at a stone wall. She put her suitcase beneath the cot. She pressed the cloth pouch flat inside her pillowcase. Then she sat on the edge of the mattress and allowed herself exactly 3 minutes to feel how frightened she was. 3 minutes, her father's rule. Feel it fully, Evelyn. Don't pretend it isn't there, but after 3 minutes you stand up. She counted the seconds in her head. Then she stood up. The 2 women who shared the room arrived that evening. Ruth was 22, round-faced, warm-eyed, the kind of woman who laughed easily and meant every word of it. Agnes was closer to 40, quieter, with the particular wariness of someone who had learned not to expect much. Ruth took one look at Evelyn and said, "You're beautiful." "That's going to be a problem." Evelyn blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "Not from me." Ruth dropped onto her cot and yanked off her boots with a groan. "Lady Victoria, she's been around more regular lately. She's got her eye fixed on Mr. Nathaniel and she don't share well." "I'm a seamstress," Evelyn said carefully. "I'm not competition for anyone." Agnes made a sound. Not quite a laugh. "Lady Victoria," Agnes said, folding her blanket across the foot of her cot. "Don't make distinctions like that. You're young. You're in the same house as the man she wants." That's enough for her. Evelyn looked between them. What is Mr. Ashford like? Ruth and Agnes traded a glance. Quiet, Ruth said finally. Serious, but he's fair, genuinely fair. Which ain't as common as it ought to be. He's not like his mother. His mother, Evelyn repeated. Lady Margaret. Agnes said the name the way you say the name of weather you can't stop. She runs this house. Has since Mr. Ashford Sr. passed. 8 years back. She decides what's proper and what ain't. Who stays and who goes a pause. She already sent 3 housemaids away for looking at Mr. Nathaniel's absorbed this. I'm here to mend fabric, she said quietly. Not to look at anyone. But her expression said plainly. We'll see about that, honey. She was good at the work. Better than good. The estate had years of neglected mending curtains, tablecloths, formal coats that had been folded in cedar trunks since before Evelyn could sew a straight line. Her predecessor had done adequate work at best. Evelyn's stitching was invisible. Her repairs held. When she rebuilt the frayed cuffs on a set of dress shirts that most seamstresses would have declared beyond saving, Mrs. Doyle stood in the doorway of the sewing room for a long, silent moment. She said nothing, which Evelyn had already learned was the highest form of approval in this house. She asked for nothing. She caused no trouble. She ate quickly at midday and returned to her work. She did not gossip. When the boiler broke in early November and the servants' quarters had no heat for 4 days, she wrapped herself in her coat at night and said nothing about it. She had lived through worse. Much worse. She first saw Nathaniel Ashford by accident. She was crossing the main corridor carrying a repaired riding coat, dark wool, split at both shoulders, buttons replaced on her way to the wardrobe room. He came around the corner from the library with a book tucked under his arm, reading as he walked. They nearly collided at the east staircase landing. He caught the doorframe. She stepped back fast, the coat pressed to her chest. I beg your pardon, he said immediately. That was entirely my fault. No harm done. Sir. She kept her eyes lowered, stepped to pass. Is that the Dunmore coat? She stopped. Sir, he was looking at the dark wool in her arms. My father bought that coat in London. I thought the shoulders were finished. The wool itself was sound, she said. The seams had been stressed past their original thread. I rebuilt them with a double-stitch heavier gauge. Should hold better than the original construction now. A pause. He looked at her directly. You know construction techniques. My father taught me that if something is worth repairing, it's worth repairing correctly. Another pause, longer. It belonged to my father, Nathaniel said quietly. I kept it because he stopped. Started again, thank you. For taking care with it. It deserved to last, Evelyn said simply. She nodded once and moved down the corridor. She did not look back. But she heard him standing there for a moment longer than necessary before he walked on. Lady Victoria Caldwell arrived the 2nd week of November. Official reason, a fortnight's social visit. Actual reason, everyone in Harrowfield County understood it to be a courtship. And everyone was waiting to see if Lady Margaret would finally get the match she wanted. Victoria was 30 years old, sharp-featured, pale blonde. With posture so correct it looked architectural. She wore her wealth the way certain women wear perfume, not for pleasure, but to establish territory. She noticed Evelyn on her 3rd day. It happened in the upper hallway. Evelyn was returning folded linens to the cupboard. Victoria was coming from her guest rooms, her personal maid trailing 2 steps behind. You, Victoria stopped. Evelyn stopped. Ma'am, you're the new seamstress. Victoria looked her over. Slow, deliberate. The way a woman looks at something she is deciding whether she needs to deal with. Mrs. Harrington's hem tore at dinner last night, she said. She was embarrassed. She said the servants here are incompetent. I'm sorry to hear that. Ma'am, if Mrs. Harrington brings the dress to the sewing room, I'll repair it this afternoon. I didn't say I wanted it repaired. Victoria tilted her head very slightly. I said Mrs. Harrington was embarrassed. I'm telling you because someone responsible for the household's presentation ought to care. Evelyn held Victoria's gaze for exactly 1 second. Long enough to show she understood, short enough to show she wouldn't be baited. "I'll speak with Mrs. Doyle about a regular linen inspection schedule." "Ma'am, to prevent it happening again." Victoria's eyes narrowed just slightly. Then she swept past without another word. Her maid shot Evelyn a brief, apologetic glance as she followed. 3 weeks into November, the books started appearing. The first one, a volume of European history, was sitting beside the sewing room door when Evelyn arrived one morning. She assumed it was a mistake. Someone had set it down and forgotten it. She placed it on the hall table. The next morning, another one, Renaissance correspondence translated from Italian. She picked it up, opened the first page, read it standing in the doorway. Then carried it inside and read 4 chapters across the day while her hands moved through the mending from habit. The third book arrived 2 days later, French literature. She read it in a week. The fourth time, she turned the corner in the early morning and found Nathaniel himself crouching to set it down by the door. He looked up. Neither of them moved. "I wasn't sure you were reading them," he said. No embarrassment. No pretense, just a man telling the truth. "I've read all 3, she said. He stood. "What did you think of the Italian correspondence?" And Evelyn Hartwell, who had practiced invisibility like a discipline, who had told herself every single morning that she was here to mend fabric and nothing else, forgot. Cellini's letters were brilliant and insufferable in equal measure, she said. He had genuine genius and he was completely aware of it, which ruined about half of what he wrote. But the foundry passages, the actual technical descriptions of the casting work, those were extraordinary. You could feel the heat coming off the page. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "I have read those letters 4 times, he said. "You are the first person I have ever spoken to who noticed the foundry passages." She came back to herself, closed her mouth, looked down, picked up the book he'd set by the door. "Thank you, sir," she said. "For the books, Nathaniel." His voice was quiet. Not a command, just a fact he was offering her. "When there's no one else around, I'd rather you not call me, sir." She did not answer that. She went inside and closed the door and stood with her back pressed against it, the book against her chest, her heart doing something she had absolutely no patience for. "Don't," she told herself firmly. "He is not a book left by a door. You cannot simply pick him up and carry him inside." "Don't." Victoria moved in December. She was precise about it. She began manufacturing reasons to keep Evelyn occupied: a torn hem here, a missing button there, a lace collar that needed resetting for the 3rd time that week. Each request came through Mrs. Doyle, perfectly proper, perfectly reasonable, but the timing was surgical. Evelyn was summoned to Victoria's rooms exactly during the afternoon hours when Nathaniel passed through the east wing on his way to the stables. She was kept late resewing trim that hadn't needed resewing in the first place. She was sent on errands to the far side of the estate at the precise moments that put distance between her and the library. It was almost elegant. Evelyn recognized it completely. She said nothing, until one evening Ruth appeared in the sewing room doorway, breathless and low-voiced. "Victoria went to Lady Margaret today," Ruth said. "She told her you were encouraging Mr. Nathaniel's attention, that you were behaving above your station." Evelyn's needle didn't stop moving. "What did Lady Margaret say?" "She's asking Mrs. Doyle for a conduct report on you." Then Mrs. Doyle will give her report, Evelyn said. "My conduct has been correct, Evelyn." Ruth stepped fully into the room and lowered her voice further. "Lady Margaret don't need proof of improper conduct. She just needs to decide she wants you gone, that's all it takes." Evelyn set her work down. She looked at Ruth, at her genuine, worried face, and something in her chest softened despite itself. "I know," she said quietly. "But Ruth, I've already lost my home. I've already lost my father. I've already started over once from nothing." She picked up the needle again. "I cannot spend every hour being afraid of losing something I've barely begun. I'll do my work correctly. I'll keep my dignity. Whatever happens after that happens." Ruth stared at her. "How do you do that?" she whispered. "How are you not just terrified?" All the time, Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "I am terrified," she said. "Every single day. I just don't let it make my decisions for me." Lady Margaret called her to the morning room on a Thursday. Evelyn walked in and stood before the desk. She was not invited to sit. "I will be direct," Margaret said. "My son has taken an interest in you that is inappropriate to your position in this house. I'm not aware of having encouraged. I am not asking for your assessment. Clean." Flat. The voice of a woman who had been obeyed for 40 years and had no expectation of that changing. "I am telling you what I observe. Nathaniel is a grown man who is not always wise about where he directs his attention. You are an attractive young woman in a position that makes you accessible to him. I am asking you to exercise judgment that he apparently is not. What exactly are you asking me to do?" "Lady Margaret, be what you are, a servant, the appropriate boundaries that position requires her. I believe I have maintained those boundaries." Margaret's gaze sharpened. "You are arguing with me. I am clarifying a factual point." "Ma'am, I believe there is a difference." The silence in that room got very heavy. Margaret studied her, not with anger, with the particular attention of a person who is genuinely trying to understand what they are dealing with. "You have spirit," she said finally. Not a compliment. "An assessment. My father told me the same thing," Evelyn said. "He also told me that a person without spirit is simply furniture that breathes." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. "You will keep to your quarters and your work," Margaret said, her voice carrying the specific chill of absolute authority. "You will not seek out my son's company. You will not engage him beyond your duties." "Understood? Yes, ma'am, you may go." Evelyn turned toward the door. "Miss Hartwell," she stopped, did not turn. "I investigated your application," Margaret said. "Your father was Richard Hartwell, county clerk for 12 years. Before he lost the position, a deliberate pause. Before the Hartwell family lost everything, the words landed like stones dropped into still water. Evelyn did not move, did not answer. "I am not without sympathy for misfortune," Margaret said. "But misfortune does not change circumstance, and circumstance determines what is appropriate." For everyone, Evelyn opened the door and walked out. She moved down the corridor, down the servants' staircase, into the sewing room, closed the door. She put both palms flat on the work table and pressed down hard until she could feel the wood grain against her skin. She was shaking, not with grief, not with anger, with the specific, exhausting weight of being seen and misread at the same time, of being recognized and still dismissed, standing in the same room as the truth and watching it get walked around. She pressed harder against the table, counted. 2, 3, then she sat down, and she began to stitch. She had not told anyone the full truth. Not Ruth, not anyone in Harrowfield County. The version people knew, Richard Hartwell, county clerk, had made a financial error, lost his position, lost his home, died of prolonged illness, leaving his daughter alone. The version that was true, Richard Hartwell had discovered in the careful, methodical course of his duties, a pattern of land fraud being conducted by a consortium of wealthy families across the county. Several of those families appeared regularly in the society pages. One name in particular appeared in his records more than any other. He had reported what he found. Within 6 months, he was accused of embezzlement. The evidence was fabricated, but fabricated by people with resources, connections, and a powerful motivation to destroy his credibility before anyone believed him. He lost his position, lost the civil case. The legal costs took the house. He spent his remaining years quietly, painstakingly trying to document the truth. He had gotten close. The consortium had made sure he never recovered his health. Evelyn knew all of it. She had the documents, her father's careful notes, his evidence, his years of work pressed flat and sewn into the lining of her small leather suitcase under the cot. She had come to Harrowfield County with a purpose. Not for a seamstress position, not even for survival. Though survival was necessary, She had come because the family at the center of the fraud, the name that appeared most frequently in her father's handwriting, was a family she needed proximity to. A family whose private papers, whose archives, whose records would contain the corroborating evidence her father had never been able to reach on his own. She had come to Ashford Hall deliberately, and she had not accounted for the books. She had not accounted for a man who crouched by a doorframe in the early morning to leave French literature for a seamstress, because he was genuinely, simply curious whether she was reading it. She had not accounted for the way Nathaniel Ashford looked at her, not with desire, not with condescension, not with the particular obliviousness of a wealthy man toward working women, but with a specific, alert attention that made her feel uncomfortably and completely seen. The moment that broke something open happened on a Tuesday. In the main corridor, in front of witnesses, Evelyn was carrying a folded stack of mended curtains to the linen room. Victoria was coming the opposite direction with two of her visiting friends, women from county families, dressed for an afternoon visit, voices bright and carrying. Victoria saw her coming. She didn't move aside. She kept walking straight down the center of the corridor, her friends on either side, and when Evelyn stepped to the right to give way, as was correct, as was expected, as was the way it always worked, Victoria's shoulder caught the stack of curtains deliberately. The whole pile went to the floor. Victoria didn't stop walking. "Oh dear," she said lightly, not looking back. "Do be more careful." "Won't you?" Her friends laughed. Evelyn stood in the corridor with the curtains at her feet. She did not move for a moment. Then she crouched and began to gather them, smoothing each fold back into place, checking the fabric for damage with her hands. "Allow me." She looked. Nathaniel was crouching beside her. He picked up the nearest curtain panel, folded it with hands that were clearly not accustomed to folding curtains, but were trying sincerely. He looked at her face as he handed it over. "Nathaniel." Victoria's voice came from down the corridor, sharp now, the lightness gone out of it entirely. "What on earth are you doing?" He didn't look at her. "Helping," he said simply. He handed Evelyn the last folded panel. Their hands were close, not touching but close. "Are you all right?" he said quietly. "Just for her, I'm perfectly fine, sir," she said. He looked at her steadily. "I'm perfectly fine," she said again. And she held his gaze just long enough to let him know she meant it, that she was not broken, not humiliated, not in need of rescuing, just a woman picking up curtains. He nodded once. He stood and turned and walked back down the corridor toward Victoria. Evelyn didn't hear what he said to her. She had already moved on toward the linen room, the curtains held correctly in her arms. But Ruth told her that evening that Victoria's face had gone the color of new plaster, and that Lady Margaret had watched the whole thing from the doorway of the sitting room, and that the expression on Lady Margaret's face had been entirely unreadable. Lady Margaret made her offer 3 days before Christmas. Morning room, same arrangement. Evelyn standing, Margaret at her desk. The space between them carrying all the weight of the previous weeks. $400, Margaret said. 2.5 years of your wages. Paid immediately. A written recommendation strong enough to secure you a comparable position anywhere in this state. Evelyn was quiet. In exchange, Margaret continued, "You leave Ashford Hall within the week. You have no contact with my son after your departure. You do not return to this county." A silence. "That is generous," Evelyn said. "It is. I can't accept it." Something moved in Margaret's expression. Not surprise exactly. More like confirmation. "I want you to be certain you understand what you're refusing," she said. "I understand exactly what I'm refusing," Evelyn said. "Money to disappear, without any payment." "Yes." "You can, and you still refuse." Evelyn looked at her directly. "I cannot accept a reward for leaving with my dignity," she said. "If you want me gone, send me away. But I won't be paid to vanish." The silence that followed was the longest yet. Margaret rose from her desk. She moved to the window and stood with her back to the room, looking out at the frozen grounds. "Your father," she said at last, "was told something similar once." that certain parties would make his legal difficulties disappear if he would simply agree to stop pursuing certain inquiries. A pause. He refused as well. The room went absolutely still. Evelyn stared at Margaret's back. "You knew about my father," she said. Not a question. A door opening. "Knew of him," Margaret said, without turning. "We were not acquainted, but I was aware of the circumstances of his removal from office." A longer pause. "My late husband had some involvement with the consortium whose interests your father's investigation threatened." The air in the room shifted. Evelyn stood very still. "I was not aware of the full nature of the fraud at the time," Margaret continued. "I became aware of it later, after my husband's death, when I went through his papers." She paused. "I have had 8 years to consider what I should have done with that knowledge." "And what did you decide?" Evelyn asked, her voice almost steady. Margaret turned from the window. She looked at Evelyn for a long moment, truly looked at her. The way she perhaps hadn't before. The way one person looks at another when they stop seeing the category and start seeing the human inside it. "I decided," Margaret said slowly, "that I have been a coward." The word fell into the silence of that room like a stone into deep water. "You may stay," Margaret said. Her voice had changed, not soft, not warm, but something had gone out of it that had been making everything harder. "For now I make no promises beyond that." Evelyn nodded once. "Thank you, Lady Margaret." She walked to the door. "Miss Hartwell." She stopped. "The locket you wear against your side," Margaret said. "Your father's?" Evelyn's hand moved involuntarily toward the pouch beneath her dress. "Yes, ma'am, I thought so." A pause. "There is an inscription inside it." "Isn't there?" It was not a question. Evelyn turned slowly to look at her. Margaret's face showed nothing, but her eyes showed something that had been locked away for a very long time. "You have seen this locket before," Evelyn said quietly. "Good night, Miss Hartwell," Margaret said, and she turned back to the window. Evelyn walked down the corridor, down the stairs, into the cold of the east wing. She sat on the edge of her cot. She took the cloth pouch from beneath her dress and opened it, lifted the locket out by its fine chain, turned it in her fingers until she found the small catch, and pressed it open. Inside on the left panel, a portrait no larger than a thumbnail. A young woman she had never known, her grandmother. Her father had told her. A woman from a family that had once mattered in this county. On the right panel, the inscription, engraved so small you needed good light to read it. "To E.H. whose worth no circumstance can diminish." She closed the locket. She pressed it against her palm. And she sat in the cold and the silence and understood, for the first time, that the story she had come here to find was not the story she had thought she was looking for. Her father's fraud case, the consortium, the documents in the suitcase lining. Those were real. Those still needed to be answered. But there was something else here. Something older. Something that had been sitting in this house for 8 years waiting for someone with the right name to walk through the gate. She pressed the locket harder against her palm. "Who are you?" Really, not with fear, with the precise, focused calm of a woman who has learned to ask the right questions. "And what did this house do to your family before your father ever discovered that ledger?" Outside, the Colorado wind pushed against the stone walls of Ashford Hall. The iron gates at the end of the drive creaked in the dark. And somewhere in the main house, a lamp still burned in the library window. Some truths, Evelyn thought, don't come looking for you. You have to be brave enough and still enough to let them find you. She held the locket against her heart and waited. The morning after Margaret said goodnight and turned back to her window, Evelyn woke before the sun came up and lay on her narrow cot staring at the ceiling. The locket pressed flat against her sternum under her nightgown. She had not slept more than 2 hours, not from fear, not from grief, from something closer to the feeling you get when a door you've been pushing against for years suddenly swings open and you realize you had no plan at all for what to do when it actually moved. Margaret Ashford had seen that locket before, which meant Margaret Ashford knew something about the Hartwell family that went further back than her father's removal from the county clerk's office. Further back than the fraud. Further back than anything Evelyn had sewn into the lining of her suitcase. She pressed the locket harder against her chest. Think, she told herself. Not what you feel, what you know. What she knew. Her father had spent 12 years as county clerk before they destroyed him. What she knew, the Hartwell family had once been something in this county, her grandmother's portrait in the locket. The inscription, the fine gold chain that was too expensive for a family that was supposed to have always been ordinary. What she knew, Margaret Ashford, a woman who had spent 8 years carrying something she called cowardice, had recognized a locket she should have had no reason to recognize. What she didn't know why, she got up, she dressed. She went to work. She told herself the not knowing was fine. She was good at carrying things she couldn't yet put down. The sewing room was cold and quiet at that hour, and she was grateful for both. She had been at her table for less than 20 minutes when the door opened without a knock. Nathaniel stood in the doorway. He was dressed for riding coat on, hat in his hand, but he wasn't moving toward the stables. He was standing in her doorway at 6 in the morning, looking at her the way a man looks at something he has been thinking about all night. "You're here early," he said. "I'm always here early." "Sir Nathaniel." She looked at him. "You're here early yourself." He came in. Didn't sit, just stood near the work table with his hat turning slowly in his hands. A gesture she'd noticed he made when he was working something out in his head. "My mother spoke to me last night," he said. Evelyn's hands went still on the fabric in front of her. "She told me she offered you money to leave," he said. "And that you refused. That was a private conversation between your mother and me. She told me herself," he said. "Voluntarily. Which, if you knew my mother, you'd understand is approximately as likely as the creek running uphill." He paused. "She also told me she'd been her word was unjust. That she had been unjust toward you." Evelyn looked at him steadily. "Your mother is a complicated woman." "She is." He set his hat on the edge of her work table. "Evelyn, why are you really here?" The question landed exactly the same way it had the first time he'd asked it. Weeks ago in the corridor, with a weight and a directness that made her chest tighten. "I told you," she said, "I needed a position. You told me that before," he said. "I let it go then because it wasn't my place to push. But something happened last night between you and my mother. And whatever it was, it changed her. And I have not seen my mother change in 8 years. He looked at her directly. "So I'm asking you again, why are you here?" She looked at him. She thought of her father's handwriting. She thought of the documents in the suitcase. She thought of 12 years of careful, honest service and what had been done to it. She also thought of a man crouching by a doorframe with a book about Italian foundry work, genuinely hoping she'd found something worth reading. "I'm looking for something," she said carefully. "Something that belongs to my family." "What kind of something?" "The kind that can't be retrieved without access to the right records." She held his gaze. "The kind of records that a family like yours would keep in a private archive." The silence between them was very specific, the kind that happens when two people are both understanding something at the same time, and neither of them is sure yet what to do with it. "You think there's something in our archive that concerns your family," he said. "I think it's possible. And you took a position as a seamstress in this house to get close enough to find out." She didn't answer. Which was itself an answer. Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment. He picked up his hat, put it down again. "My father's archive is in the East Library," he said finally. "The one adjacent to the main collection. It hasn't been fully reviewed since his death." A pause. "I have the key." She stared at him. "Whatever your father was looking for," he said quietly. "I want to know if he was right." He met her eyes. "Because if he was right, and if my family had any part in what happened to him, then I have a great deal more to answer for than leaving books by a door." She looked at him for a long time. "Why?" she asked, genuinely asking. "You barely know me." "I know enough," he said simply. I know you take care with things that deserve to last. I know you read Cellini and noticed the foundry passages. I know you refused $400 rather than be paid for your own dignity. He picked his hat up properly this time. That's more than I know about most people I've known for years. He walked to the door. Stopped, the East Library. Tonight after the household is down. I'll leave the key under the third book from the left on the hallway shelf, the one with the red spine. He glanced back at her. You won't be doing anything wrong, it's my archive. I'm giving you permission. He left. Evelyn sat at her work table and did not move for a full minute. Then she picked up her needle and began to stitch with hands that were not quite steady. She had come here with a plan, a careful, contained, solitary plan. She had not planned for this. She was beginning to think, with a mixture of something like hope and something like dread, that plans were perhaps not her strongest skill. The day passed with the particular slowness of days when you are waiting for something. She worked through the mending pile with mechanical precision, her mind running 3 steps ahead and 1 step sideways simultaneously. She ate at midday and returned immediately. She avoided Victoria, which required some navigation, because Victoria seemed to have developed a talent for appearing in corridors at inopportune moments. It was Ruth who brought the first warning. She slipped into the sewing room mid-afternoon with her shoulders up around her ears and closed the door behind her with exaggerated care. Victoria is asking questions about you, Ruth said without preamble. Specific questions. Where you came from before here. Who your father was. Whether you have any family connections in this county. Evelyn kept her eyes on her work. What kind of answers is she getting? Mrs. Doyle's not saying much. But one of the footmen, Thomas, the young one, he overheard Victoria talking to her companion last night. Ruth lowered her voice further. She said she'd written to someone in the county records, asking about the Hartwell name. Evelyn's needle stopped. She's digging, Ruth said. Evelyn, she's trying to find something she can use. She won't find anything useful in the county records, Evelyn said, resuming her stitching with deliberate calm. The official record of my father's case says exactly what the people who fabricated it wanted it to say. That's not. Ruth stopped. Stared at her. What do you mean fabricated? Evelyn looked up. She considered for a moment. Ruth was kind. Ruth was loyal in the uncomplicated way of a person who had simply decided she liked you and would act accordingly. She was not equipped for the full weight of what Evelyn was carrying. But she deserved more than nothing. My father did not make a financial error, Evelyn said quietly. He found something he wasn't supposed to find, and powerful people made sure he was discredited before anyone believed him. She paused. That is the truth. I can't prove it yet, but I will. Ruth stared at her. Lord in heaven, she whispered. Evelyn, does Mr. Nathaniel know? He knows enough, Evelyn said. And Evelyn held her gaze. More than she's let on. Ruth sat down on the spare stool in the corner as if her legs had made the decision for her. She was quiet for a moment, processing. That's why you came here, she said finally. It wasn't an accusation. It was a woman putting pieces together. It wasn't just about a sewing position, no, Evelyn said. It wasn't. Ruth stopped. Started again. More carefully, it's also become something else, hasn't it? Evelyn did not answer that. Which was, again, its own kind of answer. Ruth looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was equal parts worry and something almost maternal. You be careful, Ruth said quietly. That woman has got sharp eyes and sharper intentions. And Lady Margaret, she hesitated. Lady Margaret is changing. I've seen it this past week. Something shifted in her. But a woman who's been a certain way for 40 years doesn't change all at once without something going wrong in the middle of the changing. I know, Evelyn said. Do you, Ruth? Evelyn set her work down and looked at her friend directly. I have been navigating dangerous people with smiles and correct speech since I was 19 years old. I know exactly what I'm doing. Ruth looked at her. I know you do, she said. That's what scares me. She got up and left. Evelyn sat in the quiet of the sewing room and thought about that for exactly 3 minutes. Then she stood up. The East Library was unlocked when she arrived that night. Not because of the key under the red-spine book, though it was there, exactly where he said it would be, but because the door was already slightly open, a thin line of lamplight showing at the base of it. And when she pushed it open, she found Nathaniel already inside, sitting at the reading table, with 3 stacks of leather-bound ledgers in front of him and his coat still on. "I thought you were leaving the key and going," she said. "I changed my mind." He didn't look up from the ledger he was reading. "I know this archive, you don't. It'll take you all night to find anything alone. With me it takes 2 hours. He turned a page. She sat down. "What year?" he asked. 1878 to 1884, she said. "That's when the land transfers would have happened. The ones my father found the irregularities in." Nathaniel reached for a different ledger without hesitating. Found the year. Opened it flat between them. They worked in silence for a while, the specific, focused silence of 2 people reading with purpose. The lamplight was warm. The house was quiet around them. Outside, the Colorado wind had settled into the low, steady sound it made on calm nights, more breath than howl. He found the first irregularity 20 minutes in. "Here," he said. She leaned over to look. His finger was on an entry, a land transfer. Dated March 1879, from a family named Caldwell to a consortium listed under a business name she didn't recognize. She went very still. "Caldwell," she said. "Victoria's family," he said. His voice was carefully neutral, in the way of a man working hard to keep his reaction from getting ahead of his thinking. "Her father. He was one of the original consortium members." Evelyn looked at the entry. Then at the next one, then the one below that. "My father's notes mention this business name," she said quietly. 3 times. He couldn't identify who was behind it. Nathaniel turned back 2 pages. Found what he was looking for. "It's a holding company. Registered in Denver. The founding members are listed here." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, without expression, "My father's name is 3rd on the list." The lamplight flickered. "Neither of them moved, Nathaniel," Evelyn said carefully. "How much did your father document?" he asked. His voice was steady. The steadiness of a man who has just been hit hard and is deciding, in real time, not to fall. She said, "Not everything. He couldn't get to the primary records. That's why he never won the case." "The primary records are here," Nathaniel said. "In this archive." He looked at her directly. He never had access to them because he had no reason to believe a county clerk had the right to request private family documents. "But you do," Evelyn said. "I do." He looked back at the ledger. "It's my archive. My family's records. And I am going to read every page of them." A pause. "And then I am going to decide what to do about what I find." She looked at him. She had come to this house expecting to find evidence and fight for it alone. She had expected opposition, obstruction, and the specific brand of institutional silence that powerful people use to protect themselves. She had not expected this, a man choosing in the quiet of his own library to open his family's history and look at it honestly. "This will cost you," she said. "Whatever's in these pages, if it's what my father believed it was, it will cost you. Your family's reputation, your place in this county. I know that. Then why?" He looked at her for a moment. "Because your father spent 12 years doing his job correctly. And it killed him." He closed the ledger carefully. "That cannot simply be allowed to be the end of the story." She looked at him. "My father used to say," she said quietly, "that the most dangerous thing a corrupt system ever encounters is a man with nothing to protect but his integrity." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "Your father was a wise man," he said. "He was," she said. "They destroyed him anyway." He met her eyes. "They did. And they are not going to do it again." They worked in that library for 3 hours. By the time they were done, they had found enough. Not everything, not the complete chain of evidence her father had been assembling, but enough to establish the pattern, enough to show that the land transfers had been fraudulent and coordinated. Enough to show that the embezzlement charge against Richard Hartwell had been filed within 3 weeks of him formally requesting access to records he now had in front of him. Enough to show that the timing was not coincidence. And enough to show that the Ashford named Nathaniel's father had been at the center of it. Nathaniel closed the last ledger at midnight. He sat back in his chair and said nothing for a full minute. Then he said, "I need you to let me handle this carefully." "What does carefully mean?" Evelyn asked. Not with suspicion, with genuine question. "It means I don't go to the county sheriff tomorrow morning with a stack of old ledgers and my family's name on a holding company document," he said. "Because that gets buried in a week by people who are still very much alive and very much motivated to bury it." He looked at her. "Your father went the direct route. I watched what happened to him. I want to go differently." She held his gaze. "What route?" "I know a man in Denver. A federal land commissioner. He's been investigating irregularities in county land transfers across the state for 2 years. He's not local. He has no connections to any of the families in this room." Nathaniel paused. "If I bring him what's in these ledgers along with whatever your father documented, it goes federal." "It doesn't disappear." Evelyn was quiet for a long moment. "You would do this," she said, "to your own family's legacy." "My father is dead," Nathaniel said plainly. "His legacy is whatever the truth of it turns out to be. I would rather know that truth than protect a comfortable lie." He looked at her steadily. "Is that so difficult to understand?" She thought of her father at his desk in the small house, working by lamplight long after she'd gone to bed. His careful handwriting filling page after careful page. "No," she said quietly. "It's not difficult to understand at all." They gathered the relevant documents carefully, Nathaniel marking the pages with strips of paper, Evelyn writing a precise inventory of each entry in her own hand to cross-reference with her father's notes. They worked quietly, efficiently, with the focused coordination of 2 people who turned out, without ever having discussed it, to approach problems the same way. At one point their hands reached for the same ledger at the same time. Stopped, both pulled back. Neither of them said anything. But the pause lasted a fraction too long to be nothing. She left the library first. He stayed to return the ledgers to their correct positions, nothing out of place. Nothing to suggest the archive had been visited. She walked down the corridor in the dark with the inventory list folded inside her dress. Her heart beat steadier than it had been in months. She had come to this house with a purpose, and for the first time since arriving, she felt the shape of that purpose becoming something achievable. Not safe, but real. What she did not know, walking through that dark corridor, was that a door at the far end of the hall had been standing open, and that someone had been awake. She found out the next morning. Victoria was in the breakfast room when Evelyn came through to collect the linen that needed pressing. The room had other people in it, 2 of the visiting lady guests, and Agnes clearing the sideboard. Victoria waited until Agnes left. Then she turned. "Miss Hartwell," she said pleasantly. "You were up very late last night." Evelyn continued collecting the linen. "I had mending to finish, ma'am." In the East Library, the room went quiet. The 2 lady guests looked up from their plates. Evelyn did not stop moving. "I was returning books to the library shelf, ma'am. Mr. Nathaniel asked me to refile some volumes last week. At midnight, I had mending to finish first. As I said." Victoria set her keys. Deliberate click. "What a useful excuse mending turns out to be," she said. "It seems to provide an explanation for nearly everything you do in this house." The 2 guests were very still. This had crossed from social friction into something with teeth, and they both knew it. Evelyn folded the last piece of linen. She straightened. She looked at Victoria with the same expression she had used in the hallway, with the bucket of water steady, clear, communicating nothing that could be used against her. "Is there something that needs mending for you today?" "Lady Victoria," she asked. The pleasantness left Victoria's face entirely. "You think you're very clever," she said quietly. "The public performance was gone. This was something more direct and considerably less controlled. "I think I'm a seamstress doing her work, ma'am," Evelyn said. "If there's nothing I can help you with, you should know," Victoria said, cutting across her, "that I have written to an associate in Denver. Someone with access to property, old records." She paused. "The Hartwell name appears in some interesting places." "Miss Hartwell. Places that don't entirely match the story of a simple county clerk's family." Evelyn looked at her. Something cold moved through her, not fear, but recognition. Victoria wasn't fishing. She'd found something, or thought she had. Something about the Hartwell name in the old property records. The same records that Evelyn had only begun to understand the significance of last night. Whatever she'd found, she thought it was a weapon. What she couldn't know yet, was that it might actually be something else entirely. "You're welcome to investigate whatever you'd like." "Ma'am," Evelyn said, her voice completely level, "I have nothing to hide." She picked up the linen and left. In the corridor, she walked quickly, not running, but covering ground. Her mind was moving fast. If Victoria had found references to the Hartwell name in the Denver property records, then she had found the same land transfers Evelyn and Nathaniel had been looking at the previous night, but from the other side. From the public-facing side that showed transfers to, not from, the Hartwell name appearing in property records. She stopped walking. Her grandmother the locket. To E. H, whose worth no circumstance can diminish. Her father had always spoken about the family that was lost the position. The house, the land, as if it was a slow erosion. Hard years, bad decisions, the ordinary of a family declining over generations. But what if it hadn't been ordinary? What if the Hartwell land, whatever there had been of it, had been part of the same web of fraudulent transfers? What if her father had entered the consortium by professional accident? What if he had found them because they had taken something from his own family long before he ever opened a ledger in his capacity as county clerk? She stood in the corridor with the linen in her arms and felt the shape of the story rearranging itself around her in real time, growing older and deeper and more deliberate than she had imagined. She needed to talk to Margaret, not Nathaniel, Margaret. Because Margaret had said, "I became aware of it later. After my husband's death, when I went through his papers." And Margaret had recognized the locket, and Margaret had called herself a coward. She went to her work. She moved through the rest of the morning with outward calm and inward urgency, finishing what needed to be finished, making no errors, giving no one anything to report. She sent a folded note through Agnes, not Ruth, because Ruth's face showed everything she was thinking, requesting a few minutes of Lady Margaret's time that afternoon. The answer came back in an hour, 3 o'clock, the morning room. Margaret was standing when Evelyn arrived, not at her desk. Standing near the fireplace, which was different, smaller somehow, though she was the same imposing woman she had always been. The authority was still there, but something beneath it had shifted in the past 24 hours. And whatever that shift was, it had not been comfortable. "I know why you're here," Margaret said before Evelyn could speak. "Victoria. I know what Victoria found," Margaret said. "She came to me this morning. Before breakfast." Evelyn went still. "What did she tell you?" "She told me the Hartwell name appears in property transfer records from the late 1870s. That your family once held land in this county, considerable land, that transferred to a private holding company in 1876. Margaret paused. 2 years before your father became county clerk. 2 years before. "He never knew," Evelyn said very quietly. "My father never knew it started with his own family." "No," Margaret said. "I don't believe he did." She looked at the fire. The transfer was not clean, but it was buried well enough that a man working as county clerk a decade later would have found it only if he was specifically looking for it. And he wouldn't have had reason to look for it, unless he stumbled on the same holding company through other transfers, Evelyn said. Which is exactly what happened. He found it through the Caldwell transfers. He pulled the thread. He didn't know it led back to his own family's land until she stopped. He never got far enough to know. Margaret turned to look at her. He might have, she said, if he'd had more time. They made sure he didn't. Yes, the word was quiet and absolute. They did. The fire snapped. Neither woman moved. Victoria thinks this information damages you, Evelyn said. She thinks it proves your family is entangled with mine in a way that looks improper. That it gives her something to use. Yes, Margaret said. That is what she thinks. She's wrong, Evelyn said. It doesn't damage me, it clarifies everything. Margaret looked at her steadily. I know, she said. I know that now. A long pause. Lady Margaret, Evelyn said carefully. Your husband's papers. Is there documentation of the original 1876 Hartwell transfer? Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then she crossed to the writing desk, opened the lower drawer, took out a small bundle of folded papers tied with a faded ribbon. She set them on the desk without handing them over. I have had these for 8 years, she said. I told myself I was keeping them because I didn't know what to do with them. That is partly true. She paused. The other part is that I was afraid of what doing the right thing would cost this family. She looked at Evelyn. I am less afraid of that now than I am of what it cost to keep doing nothing, she said. She pushed the papers across the desk. Evelyn picked them up. Her hands were steady, but her throat was very tight. Thank you, she said. My father would have, Margaret said, was a better man than my husband, and I am sorry it took me 8 years and a seamstress with a gold locket to say so out loud. Evelyn looked at her. She thought of a woman who had spent 40 years being powerful and 8 years being a coward by her own reckoning. Standing at a window in December saying, I have had these for 8 years, and still handing the papers over. It was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the kind of thing that cost considerably more than $400. You are not the woman I expected when I walked through those gates, Evelyn said quietly. Margaret's chin lifted slightly. I am not the woman I expected to be either, she said. At this point in my life, Evelyn threw carefully inside her dress. She moved toward the door. Miss Hartwell, Margaret's voice stopped her. Evelyn paused. No, she said. I didn't think she was. She intends to make her case to the county families at the Easter gathering. In 6 weeks, in front of everyone who matters in this county. She plans to use what she's found to make Nathaniel understand that aligning himself with you or your father's legacy will cost him everything. Evelyn stood with her hand near the door. 6 weeks. She thought of the archive documents she and Nathaniel had cataloged last night. She thought of her father's notes in the suitcase. She thought of the papers now tucked against her ribs. She thought of Nathaniel's federal contact in Denver. 6 weeks was enough if they moved now, if they moved carefully. If nothing went wrong. She turned back to look at Margaret one last time. Then we have 6 weeks to make sure the truth is louder than Victoria's version of it, she said. And I am going to need your help. Margaret looked at her for a long moment. Then, for the first time, something happened in Margaret Ashford's face that wasn't authority or calculation or carefully managed regret. Something that looked very much, against all probability, like resolve. All right, Miss Hartwell, she said quietly. Tell me what you need. 6 weeks sounds like a long time until you're inside them. Evelyn learned that quickly. The first week passed in a controlled kind of urgency, the sort that looks like calm from the outside and feels like a held breath from the inside. She and Nathaniel worked in the East Library on 3 separate evenings, cataloging the archive documents methodically, building the chain of evidence her father had never been able to complete. Margaret's papers filled the gaps that the ledgers alone couldn't close. Together, the 3 sources told a story so clean and so damning that Evelyn's hands shook the first time she read the complete sequence from beginning to end. Not from fear, from the specific overwhelming feeling of watching 12 years of her father's life be proven right. She pressed her palms flat on the table and breathed through it. Nathaniel watched her without speaking. He had learned. in the weeks since the library that she did not want comfort when she was processing something. She wanted space and silence and the respect of being allowed to feel it without someone trying to make it smaller. He gave her that. It was, she thought, more than most people managed. The second week was when things started to move faster than she had planned. It began on a Tuesday morning when Agnes found her in the sewing room with an expression that meant trouble before she opened her mouth. "Thomas came to me this morning," Agnes said, closing the door behind her. "The young footman. He said Lady Victoria had a visitor last night." Late. After the household was down, Evelyn set her work aside. "Who?" A man Thomas didn't recognize came to the side entrance. Victoria met him herself, didn't use the bell, didn't call anyone. They spoke for about 20 minutes in the small parlor. Agnes paused. Thomas said the man had the look of someone from the county offices. Official, carrying a document case. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "She's moving faster than I expected," she said. "What does that mean for you?" "It means we have less than 6 weeks." She stood. "It means I need to speak with Nathaniel today." She found him coming out of the stables mid-morning. He saw her face and fell into step beside her without being asked, walking toward the far end of the grounds where the wind carried sound away from the house. "Victoria had a late visitor," she said quietly. "Official type." "Document case." Nathaniel's jaw tightened slightly. "County assessor's office?" Thomas couldn't say. "But the timing aligns with what your mother told me. Victoria plans to make her case at Easter. If she's pulling official documents now, she's building something formal." Evelyn paused. "Nathaniel, how quickly can you reach your contact in Denver?" "I can wire him today. Do it." He looked at her. "We won't have everything compiled by the time he arrives." "We have enough," she said. "We have the ledgers, your mother's papers, and my father's documentation. That's 3 independent sources pointing at the same transactions. It's enough to open a federal inquiry." She met his eyes. "A federal inquiry cannot be buried by county families. Victoria knows that, which is why we have to get there first." He nodded once. No hesitation. She had noticed this about him, that when he made a decision, he made it completely. There was no performance of deliberation. No looking for someone else to confirm what he already knew. He simply decided and moved. It was, she thought, a rare quality in anyone. Rarer still in someone who had been raised to believe his family's name was protection enough against consequences. "I'll wire him today," he said. "I'll say it's urgent. Tell him it concerns fraudulent land transfers involving federal territories," she said. "That gets his attention faster than anything else." He looked at her with a slight expression. She had come to recognize something between admiration and amusement that he kept carefully understated. "You've thought about this for a long time," he said. "My whole adult life," she said simply. "Now go wire your man." She turned back toward the house. He caught her arm, not roughly, just a hand on her sleeve, stopping her for a moment. She turned. "Whatever happens with the inquiry," he said quietly. "Whatever the federal commissioner finds, and however this ends, I need you to know that I am not doing this because of obligation, or guilt, or because my family owes yours a debt." She looked at him steadily. "Then why?" "Because you deserve to see your father's work finished," he said. "And because I would do this for you regardless of what the ledgers said." The wind moved between them. She looked at him for a long moment, at this man who left books by doorframes and crouched beside her to pick up curtains and sat in his own library until midnight reading his dead father's crimes with the same steady expression he brought to everything. "Go wire your man," she said quietly. But she didn't pull her arm away for another moment. And he didn't let go. The wire went out Tuesday afternoon. The reply came Thursday morning, and Nathaniel brought it to her directly, rather than routing it through anyone else. She read it standing in the corridor. Arriving Saturday. "Bring everything. Commissioner J. Hartwell, Federal Land Office." Denver Saturday was 4 days away. She folded the wire carefully and tucked it inside her dress. 4 days. She went back to the sewing room and worked through the afternoon without stopping. Her hands moved steadily through the mending. Her mind moved at a different pace entirely. What she did not know, could not have known, was that someone had already intercepted a copy of the outgoing wire. She found out Friday morning. She came down to the sewing room before 6 and found the door already open. Inside, sitting on the spare stool in the corner, with her hands folded in her lap and an expression Evelyn had never seen on her face before, was Lady Margaret. Not in the morning room, not at her writing desk. In the sewing room, in the early morning alone. Evelyn stopped in the doorway. "Shut the door," Margaret said. Evelyn shut it. "Victoria knows about the federal commissioner," Margaret said. "She knows he's arriving Saturday. She knows what you've been compiling." She paused. "She has a copy of the wire Nathaniel sent to Denver." The cold that moved through Evelyn was not panic. It was something colder than panic, and more focused, the specific chill of realizing that a threat you knew was coming has arrived earlier than planned. "How did she get it?" Evelyn asked. "The telegraph operator in town," Margaret said. "His brother-in-law works for the Caldwell family. Victoria has had the telegraph office watched since December." Margaret's voice was flat and precise. "I learned this morning from Thomas, who heard it from the stable hand, who heard Victoria telling her maid that she intends to be ready for the commissioner's arrival." "What does ready mean?" "It means she spent the past week preparing a counter-narrative," Margaret said. "A formal one. Documents showing Nathaniel's mental state has been compromised. That his recent behavior represents a departure from sound judgment. That he has been, her word, manipulated by a woman with a personal agenda and a fabricated family history." Evelyn stared at her. "She's going to try to discredit Nathaniel," she said. "Yes, not just me, him. You were always the easier target," Margaret said. "But she's smart enough to know that attacking you directly only works if she can first make Nathaniel look like a man who can't be trusted to judge people correctly." She looked at Evelyn with the directness that had always been the most striking thing about her. "She is going to walk into Saturday's meeting with a doctor's statement questioning my son's judgment and a legal document suggesting he be temporarily removed from control of estate decisions pending Ada. Competency review." The silence in the room was absolute. Evelyn started. "Legal," Margaret said, "in this county. With the right judge. And she has the right judge. Judge Pollard. He owes the Caldwell family a considerable political debt." She paused. "If she moves first on Saturday, before the commissioner hears the land evidence, Nathaniel loses the authority to present anything. Every document we've compiled becomes legally inadmissible because the man who authorized access to the archive is under competency review." Evelyn sat down. She sat at her own work table and put her hands flat on the surface and looked at nothing for a long moment. Victoria had not been digging for a weapon to use at Easter dinner. She had been building a case, a complete, legal, systematically constructed case designed to do to Nathaniel exactly what had been done to Evelyn's father, remove him from his authority before he could use it. Then discredit everything he'd found. History, Evelyn thought with something that tasted like bitter recognition, did not change its methods much. "She's been planning this since November," Evelyn said quietly. "Since before she had any specific information about what we were doing. She was already building the competency strategy, in case Nathaniel chose a different direction than what she wanted." "Yes," Margaret said. "And the commissioner arrives Saturday morning." "Yes, which means if we don't stop her before Saturday morning, we lose everything," Margaret said simply. Evelyn looked at her. "What time does Victoria plan to move?" she asked. "She has a meeting with Judge Pollard scheduled for 9 o'clock Saturday morning," Margaret said. "The commissioner's train arrives at 10, an hour. 1 hour of difference between a federal land fraud investigation and a competency petition that buried it." Evelyn breathed in slowly. "Then we need to move tonight," she said. Margaret nodded once. "That's why I'm sitting in your sewing room at 6 in the morning," she said. "What do you need?" What she needed was Nathaniel. She told Margaret to send him to the East Library at 10 that night and to tell no one else. Margaret went without another word. Evelyn spent the day working with mechanical efficiency. her face showing nothing, her mind running calculations on a loop. The evening meal came and went. Victoria appeared at dinner looking self-possessed and smooth, which told Evelyn everything she needed to know about Victoria's confidence in her timeline. The visiting guests talked about Easter preparations. Agnes refilled water glasses. The candlelight was warm and ordinary. Evelyn ate, returned her plate, and went to work. At 10, she was in the East Library. Nathaniel arrived 3 minutes later, took one look at her face, and closed the door. She told him everything. He sat very still while she talked. She had noticed this pattern in him. The quieter and stiller he became, the more intensely he was processing. When she finished, he was silent for almost 30 seconds. Then he said, "Judge Pollard." "Yes." "Henry Pollard owes the Caldwell family $6,000 in political debts from the 1882 election, Nathaniel said. "I know this because my father kept records of everyone he might need." He paused. "I also know that Henry Pollard has a particular sensitivity about his own record being examined. He was elected on a reform platform. The last thing he wants is federal attention on his county." Evelyn looked at him. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Nathaniel said carefully, "that if Commissioner Hartwell's office made it known informally, through the right channels, that a federal land inquiry in Harrowfield County would necessarily involve a review of all related county judicial decisions during the relevant period." "Pollard backs away from the competency petition," Evelyn said. "Pollard won't sign anything that puts his own record under federal scrutiny," Nathaniel said. "He's not brave enough for that. Can you get that message to Pollard tonight?" "My attorney is in town," Nathaniel said. "He can carry a message without explaining the context." "Attorneys do that." He paused, "But Evelyn, this is moving fast. If I'm wrong about Pollard, and he signs the petition anyway, then we go to the commissioner with what we have, and we trust that the evidence is strong enough to hold, despite the competency challenge," she said. "Which it is. It's strong enough. I've read it start to finish and it holds." "You're certain?" "I'm certain." He looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. "I'll get a message to my attorney tonight." He stood. "Evelyn, there's one more thing." She looked at him. "The competency strategy only works if there's something to point to," he said. "Victoria needs to be able to say, 'I've been behaving in ways that demonstrate compromised judgment, making decisions that don't align with family interest, spending unexplained time with a servant girl." He paused. "She will use us. Whatever we appear to be or not be, she will use it. Tomorrow, before the commissioner arrives, she will make it as visible as possible." "I know," Evelyn said. "Then you know what I'm about to say." She looked at him steadily. "You're going to say that I should keep distance from you tomorrow. That I should be invisible. That I should be exactly what Victoria wants me to be, a seamstress in a corner so she has nothing to point to. That is the tactically sensible option." "Yes," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. He looked at her. "I have spent years making myself invisible for the sake of tactical sense," she said. "I came to this house making myself invisible. I have been careful and correct and appropriate and invisible every single day since October." She met his eyes. "I am done being invisible, Nathaniel. Whatever I am and whatever we appear to be, Victoria doesn't get to dictate that. Not one more day." Then he said simply, "And for a moment." Standing in the lamplight of the East Library, with the ledgers around them, and the Colorado wind outside, and 6 months of careful distance, suddenly, not feeling careful at all, she understood that they had both just said something considerably larger than what the words themselves contained. She was the one who looked away first. "Get the message to your attorney," she said. "I'll have everything organized and ready for the commissioner's arrival." She left. She did not sleep that night. She sat on her narrow cot with her father's documentation spread across her knees and read every page again by lamplight, checking for gaps, for weaknesses, for anything Victoria's counter-narrative could exploit. She found nothing new. The evidence was what it was: patient, methodical, undeniable, like her father himself. She pressed the locket against her sternum and stared at the ceiling. She was close. She was so close she could feel the shape of it. She was also, she realized with a clarity that arrived sometime around 3 in the morning. Terrified in a way she hadn't allowed herself to be since she'd arrived. Not the ordinary daily fear she managed with her 3-minute rule. Something deeper. The fear of what happens when the thing you've been working toward is finally actually within reach, and you understand for the first time what it will cost if you fail. It wouldn't just be the fraud going unpunished. It wouldn't just be her father's work dismissed again. If Victoria won on Saturday, Nathaniel lost control of his own estate. Margaret's papers, offered after 8 years of carrying them, became inadmissible. The federal commissioner went back to Denver with nothing. And Evelyn went back to being what the county thought she was, a seamstress, with an agenda and a fabricated story about a dishonest father. She sat with that weight for exactly 3 minutes. Then she stood up. She began to organize. By 5 in the morning, every document was cataloged, cross-referenced, and arranged in the sequence she intended to present. By 6, she had written a clean summary, 2 pages, precise and plain, that laid out the complete chain of evidence without legal language. The kind of summary a federal commissioner could read in 10 minutes and understand completely. By 7, she was dressed, correct, and at her sewing table when the household began to move. The day arrived the way days arrive when everything is about to either break open or collapse, looking entirely like any other day. Victoria appeared at breakfast with the specific brightness of a woman who is very pleased with herself. She wore a dark blue traveling dress, which meant she planned to be out of the house before noon. Going to Pollard's office at 9, Evelyn thought. Right on schedule. Nathaniel appeared at breakfast looking composed. He met Evelyn's eyes across the room for exactly 1 second. She gave him the smallest possible nod. His attorney had gotten the message to Pollard. She could see it in the steadiness of his face. Margaret did not come to breakfast. Evelyn noticed that, and noticed the door to Margaret's private sitting room was closed when she passed it at 8, and noticed the faint sound of movement inside. She did not knock. Whatever Margaret was preparing in that room, she was preparing it alone. And that, Evelyn had learned, was how Margaret Ashford did her most important work. 9 o'clock came. Victoria put on her coat, called for the carriage, and left. Evelyn watched from the sewing room window, which looked out at a stone wall. But she'd learned which crack in that wall gave a slant view of the drive, and watched the Caldwell carriage pull away toward town. Her stomach was very tight. At 9:45, a second carriage came back. The wrong direction, not from town, from the North Road. Victoria's carriage. Returning. Evelyn was in the corridor outside the morning room 40 seconds later. She heard Victoria's voice before she reached the door, sharp. Stripped of its usual pleasantness, the voice of a woman who had hit a wall she hadn't expected. He refused? The words came through the door like something thrown. He simply refused? A murmured response from her companion. He said a federal review would encompass county judicial records. Another pause. That coward, that absolute. Evelyn stepped back from the door before it opened. Victoria came out fast. She stopped when she saw Evelyn standing in the corridor. For a moment, neither of them moved. Something happened in Victoria's face, a crack in the architecture of it. Something raw and furious pushing through the surface before she got it under control. In that moment, she looked less like the composed county socialite she had been performing for months, and more like what she actually was. A woman who had planned very carefully and been outmaneuvered. She looked at Evelyn. You, she said, Evelyn said. You did this, son. The certainty in it was absolute. You and Nathaniel. You went to Pollard before I could. Evelyn said nothing. Victoria stepped closer. Her voice dropped to something private and contained, and considerably more dangerous than her public manner. Do you have any idea, she said quietly, what you're doing? To this family? To Nathaniel? Whatever you think you're fixing, whatever your father thought he found, you are pulling a thread that unravels everything. Not just the people who deserve it, everyone, The name. The estate, the county's respect for this family. She paused. You are going to destroy everything Nathaniel has because you are angry about your father. Evelyn looked at her steadily. No, she said. I am going to tell the truth about what happened to my father. What gets destroyed in the process of telling the truth is not my responsibility. It's the responsibility of the people who built something on lies and expected it to hold. Victoria stared at her. You really believe that, she said. Something shifted in her voice. Not admiration, not anything like that, but a kind of stunned recognition, as if she was genuinely surprised that a person could mean something that completely. Yes, Evelyn said simply, I do. Victoria looked at her for a long moment. Then she said with terrible precision, it won't matter. The commissioner is one man with a report that will take months to process. In this county, with these families, it will be buried long before it ever reaches a courtroom. Maybe, Evelyn said. But it will have been said, and said clearly, and that is not nothing. She paused. My father knew they'd find a way to stop him eventually. He documented everything anyway, because truth is not diminished by the failure to immediately win. Victoria's jaw tightened. She looked at Evelyn one more time, with something that might, in another woman at another moment, have been almost respect. Then she turned and walked away. The commissioner's carriage arrived at 10:10. Commissioner James Hartwell was a tall man in his 50s. Silver-haired, with the particular economy of movement of someone who'd had spent decades separating important things from unimportant ones by simple force of attention. He shook Nathaniel's hand at the door and looked at the stack of organized documentation Evelyn had placed on the library table and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, Who compiled this? I did, Evelyn said. He looked at her with sharp, assessing eyes. You understand property law? I understand my father's documentation, she said. He taught me to follow a paper trail. I followed it. He picked up the summary she had written. Read it. Set it down. This is the clearest preliminary summary I have received in 14 years of federal land work, he said. Sit down, Miss Hartwell. I want you to walk me through it in sequence. She sat down. She began. She spoke for 40 minutes without notes. Because she had memorized every entry, every date, every name in the order they connected to one another. Nathaniel sat to her left, providing archive context when she indicated he was needed. Hartwell interrupted 6 times with precise technical questions, each of which she answered without hesitation. By the end, Hartwell was sitting forward in his chair with both forearms on the table, a posture that said he was no longer in evaluation mode. He was in decision mode. This establishes probable cause for a federal inquiry, he said. The scale of the transfers and the involvement of a federal territory land grant in 1879 brings it unambiguously under federal jurisdiction, which means it cannot be closed by county officials, Nathaniel said. Correct, it cannot. Hartwell looked at the documents. I will need to take the originals. You'll keep the copies you've made? Everything is documented, twice, Evelyn said. The originals are yours. He nodded. He began to organize his case. Then the door opened. Margaret Ashford walked in. She was dressed precisely, her bearing exactly what it always was, the bearing of a woman who understood that how you enter a room tells people everything about what you intend to do in it. She was carrying a separate bundle of documents, not the papers she had given Evelyn from the desk drawer. Something else, something older and larger, tied with a different ribbon. Hartwell looked at her. Ma'am. Lady Margaret Ashford, she said. I am the widow of William Ashford, whose name appears in the founding documents of the consortium in question. She placed the bundle on the table beside Evelyn's organized stack. These are my husband's personal correspondence regarding the land transactions from 1876 to 1884. They were not included in the archive collection. They were kept separately. She paused. They include his correspondence with the other consortium members, his knowledge of the Hartwell family's prior claim, and his personal instruction that Richard Hartwell's employment be targeted if his investigation reached the consortium's primary transactions. The room was absolutely silent. Evelyn stared at the bundle on the table, the instruction to target her father. In writing, in William Ashford's own hand, her father had never known it existed. She had never known it existed. Margaret stood on the other side of the table and did not look away from Evelyn's face while the full weight of it arrived. "I have had those letters for 8 years," Margaret said quietly. "I kept them because I thought protecting this family meant protecting what my husband built. I understand now that protecting this family means being honest about what it cost other people." She paused. "I am sorry, Miss Hartwell, that it took me this long. And that your father never heard it." Evelyn looked at her. She thought of a narrow cot in a cold room, of a man at a desk by lamplight, working, of 12 years of honest service, and what it had been worth to the people who took it apart. Of a daughter who had spent her entire adult life carrying what he hadn't been able to finish. Her throat was very tight. She did not let it show. She owed her father that much dignity, at least. "Thank you, Lady Margaret," she said. Her voice was completely steady. "For all of it." Margaret nodded once. She sat down. "And the 4 of them, a federal commissioner, an estate owner, a widow, and a seamstress with her father's locket pressed against her sternum, spent the next 2 hours closing every gap in a case that had been open for 12 years. Outside, the Colorado sky had turned the clean, hard blue of late winter, giving way to something else. Something that felt, for the first time in a very long time, like it might be the beginning of spring. Commissioner Hartwell left Ashford Hall that Saturday afternoon with 2 document cases and a federal inquiry formally opened. He shook Nathaniel's hand at the door. He nodded to Margaret. And then he looked at Evelyn, at this woman who had walked him through 12 years of buried evidence with the precision of someone who had been preparing for exactly this moment her entire adult life, and he said, "Your father would be proud, Miss Hartwell," she said. "Thank you, sir." She waited until his carriage was down the drive and the gate had closed behind it. Then she walked to the east wing, sat on her narrow cot, pressed the locket against her palm, and allowed herself exactly 3 minutes to fall completely apart. Not quietly, not in the composed, measured way she managed everything else. She pressed her fist against her mouth and shook with the force of something that had been building for years, grief and relief and fury and love, all arriving at the same moment. The way they do when the thing you've been fighting for finally actually happens, and your body doesn't know how to separate the winning from the mourning. Her father should have been in that room. He should have sat across from James Hartwell and watched the man read his work and call it the clearest preliminary summary he'd seen in 14 years. He should have been alive to hear it. 3 minutes. She wiped her face. She straightened her spine. She stood up. She had 3 weeks until Easter, and the fight was not over yet. The first week after Hartwell's visit moved in a strange double rhythm, outwardly quiet, inwardly anything but. On the surface, Ashford Hall continued its ordinary preparations for the Easter gathering. Margaret directed the household with her usual authority. The guest rooms were aired. The menu was planned. Invitations had been sent weeks ago, and acceptances had come back from every family in the county. Underneath that surface, something else entirely was happening. Word traveled in county society the way it always traveled, through servants who talked to other servants, through wives who mentioned things to their sisters, through attorneys who had professional obligations to discretion and personal obligations to their own reputations. Within 4 days of Hartwell's visit, every significant family in Harrowfield County had heard, in some version, that a federal land commissioner had spent 3 hours at Ashford Hall and left with documents. The versions varied. The fact of it did not. Evelyn heard the reactions through Ruth, who heard them through the network of servants that connected every household in the county in ways their employers generally preferred not to think about. The Whitmore family, whose patriarch had been a secondary member of the consortium, had retained a lawyer in Denver. The Fenwick family had done the same. 3 key land transfers that had been in negotiation were suddenly postponed without explanation. And the Caldwell family had gone very, very quiet. Victoria had not left her guest rooms at Ashford Hall since Saturday. She took her meals there. She sent her maid on errands but did not appear herself. The bright, armored composure she had worn every day since November was simply gone, replaced by a silence that felt less like dignity and more like a woman recalculating everything she thought she knew about her position. Evelyn did not feel triumphant about that. She was surprised to discover she felt something closer to tired. On the 5th day after Hartwell's visit, Nathaniel found her in the sewing room at midday. "My attorney received a response from Denver this morning," he said. Closing the door, Hartwell has formally registered the inquiry. "It's in the federal system. It cannot be withdrawn by anyone in this county." She let out a breath she had been holding since Saturday. "Good. There's something else." He sat down across from her the first time he had sat down in her sewing room. She realized in all the months she had been here. Hartwell's office found additional records in the Denver Federal Land Registry that my father's documents didn't include. 3 more fraudulent transfers from 1,877 that weren't in the archive. She looked at him. "More families?" "The Alcott family up north." He paused. "And one that isn't a family," she waited. "The original Hartwell land grant," he said. "From 1,872. Recorded in the Federal Registry under your grandfather's name, Elias Hartwell. A land grant of 340 acres in the Eastern County Territory." He met her eyes. "It was transferred fraudulently in 1,876, as the Denver records show. But the transfer was never properly completed at the federal level. The original grant was never legally voided." Evelyn stared at him. "What does that mean?" she said carefully. "It means," Nathaniel said, "that under federal land law the original grant may still be legally valid. That the land technically pending the inquiry's outcome and a federal review of the 1,876 transfer may still belong to the Hartwell family." He paused. "To you." The sewing room was completely silent. Evelyn looked at the work table in front of her, at the fabric under her hands, at the needle she set down when he walked in. She thought of her grandfather, whom she had never met, who had filed a land grant in 1,872 in a territory that was still finding its shape. She thought of her father, who had spent 12 years as a county clerk before he stumbled on the thread that led back to his own family's loss without ever knowing it. She thought of a locket with an inscription that said, "Whose worth no circumstance can diminish," words that had always felt like philosophy and now felt like something else entirely. Like a man who had already lost something enormous and was putting it into words so his granddaughter would know it had existed. 340 acres, she said quietly. Eastern County Territory, Nathaniel said. It borders the Ashford land on the northeast side. She looked at him then. Really looked at him. She understood what he wasn't saying, that if the land claim held, the woman who had arrived at his gate in October with a rope-tied suitcase and cracked boots was not simply a seamstress with a grievance. She was the heir to a property that had been sitting in the Federal Registry under her grandfather's name for over 50 years, waiting for someone to follow the trail back to it. "Nathaniel," she said. "I know what you're going to say," he said. "Do you? You're going to say this changes nothing about why you came here. That the land isn't the point. That your father's vindication matters more than any property." He held her gaze. "All of that is true, and none of it changes the fact that the land is yours." She was quiet for a moment. "It changes how people in this county see this story," she said carefully. "You understand that. If it comes out that the Hartwell land claim is valid, that I have a legitimate property interest here, then I'm not the servant girl with a grudge. I'm something else entirely." "Yes," he said, "Victoria will use that. She'll say I knew about the land claim all along. That my father's investigation was never about justice, it was about recovery of property. That everything I've done since arriving here was calculated to reclaim an inheritance." "Yes," he said again. She probably will. And some people will believe her. Some people will believe her, he agreed. And some people will look at everything you've actually done since October, how you've conducted yourself. How you've handled being humiliated and threatened and offered money to disappear, and they will believe something different. He paused. I believe something different. She looked at him steadily. Nathaniel, I did not know about the land grant, I know that. I came here because of my father. Not because of 340 acres. I know that too, he said quietly. You don't have to convince me, Evelyn. I am already convinced. The steadiness in his voice when he said it, not performative. Not chivalric. Just the simple sound of a man stating something he knew to be true did something to her chest she had been carefully not acknowledging for 2 months. She looked at her work table. We need to tell your mother, she said. She already knows. Hartwell's office copied her on the registry finding. A pause. She's the one who told me to come tell you directly. Evelyn looked up. Margaret told you to come. She said, and I am quoting exactly, tell her today. She deserves to know before anyone else does. And bring a chair because she'll need a moment. Though she'll pretend she doesn't. The corners of his mouth moved very slightly. She was right about the chair. Evelyn looked at the chair he had brought in and sat down in without being invited. Because he had known she would need it, even if she would never have said so. Something in her chest that had been held very tightly for a very long time loosened. Just slightly around the edges. Your mother, she said, is a more complicated woman than I initially understood. Most people are, he said. She just required more time to demonstrate it. They sat in the sewing room in the midday quiet. And for a moment neither of them needed to say anything at all. It was Ruth who broke it, appearing in the doorway with wide eyes and a look that meant something had happened. Victoria's leaving, Ruth said. Right now. She's called for her carriage and her trunks are coming down. Evelyn and Nathaniel looked at each other. Today, Nathaniel said, her maid told Agnes she's going back to Denver. Something about family business. Ruth was clearly vibrating with the effort of relaying information quickly and accurately. She went to Lady Margaret's sitting room first. They spoke for about 10 minutes. Then she called for the carriage. Nathaniel stood. No, Evelyn said. Let her go, Evelyn said quietly. She's not running. She's retreating to a better position. The difference matters. If you go after her now, you give her something to use. The image of Nathaniel Ashford, chasing Victoria Caldwell out of his house, looks like victory for her and cruelty for you. She paused. Let her leave with her dignity, and she takes her story with her. That's the better outcome. He looked at her for a moment. How do you do that, he said. Think 3 moves ahead while I'm still reacting to the first one. Practice, she said. Go about your afternoon, Nathaniel, normally. He went. Evelyn stayed at her table and listened to the sound of carriage wheels on the drive 20 minutes later. When they had faded completely, she picked up her needle and went back to work. She did not allow herself to feel relieved yet. Relief was for after Easter. Right now there was still too much that could go wrong. And she had not come this far by assuming the difficult parts were behind her. She was right to be cautious. 2 days before Easter, everything went wrong at once. It started with Margaret. Evelyn was crossing the main hall at 7 in the morning when she heard a sound she had never heard from Margaret Ashford in all her months at this house, a sound that stopped her cold and sent her through the sitting room door before she had consciously decided to move. Margaret was on the floor beside her writing desk. Not collapsed dramatically, not unconscious, but down on one knee, one hand gripping the desk edge, her face the color of old paper, breathing in the shallow, careful way of someone managing significant pain. Lady Margaret, don't. Margaret's voice was sharp despite everything. Don't call the household, don't make a scene. Evelyn was already beside her. How long? Since last night, I thought it would pass. Margaret's jaw was set hard against whatever she was feeling. It is not passing. Evelyn looked at her, took in the color of her face. The way she was holding her left arm, the careful shallowness of the breathing. Nathaniel, Evelyn said. No, he'll panic and, Evelyn said again. Not to Margaret, but raised her voice precisely enough to carry to the corridor. He appeared in 40 seconds, took one look, was at his mother's other side immediately without a word. I'm calling Dr. Hale, he said. You will not make a fuss, Margaret started. I am calling Dr. Hale, he said with a quiet authority that was absolutely his mother's own. Turned back on her, and you are going to allow it. Margaret looked at her son for a moment. Then, with the particular grace of a woman who knows when she has lost a point, she let go of the desk edge and allowed them both to help her to the settee. Dr. Hale arrived within the hour. He spent 40 minutes with Margaret while Evelyn and Nathaniel waited in the corridor outside. Nathaniel stood with his arms crossed and said nothing. Evelyn stood beside him and said nothing either. They were close enough that their shoulders were almost touching, and neither of them moved away. When Dr. Hale came out, he looked at Nathaniel with the measured expression of a man who is about to deliver information that requires careful reception. Her heart, he said quietly, it's been under strain. The past weeks paused. She needs complete rest. No excitement, no significant emotional exertion. I want her in bed for at least 4 days. Nathaniel absorbed this. Easter is in 2 days. I'm aware. She's been planning this gathering for 3 months. I'm aware of that as well, Doctor. Hale looked at him steadily. Mr. Ashford, your mother's heart is not a social calendar. Whatever she has planned for Easter, it must either be cancelled or carried out without her. Nathaniel looked at the closed door. She won't cancel, he said quietly. No, Dr. Hale agreed. She told me the same thing in approximately those words. But with more colorful emphasis, he picked up his bag. She must not stand for extended periods. She must not be allowed to become agitated. If anything significant occurs during the gathering, I want someone with her at all times. He looked directly at Evelyn. I assume that will be you, Miss Hartwell. Evelyn looked at him. Yes, she said, it will left. Nathaniel didn't move for a moment. She pushed herself, he said. The past 2 weeks coordinating with the attorney, pulling the personal correspondence, sitting in the commissioner's meeting for 2 hours. She did what she decided needed to be done, Evelyn said quietly. You cannot take that from her by regretting it on her behalf. He looked at her. Something passed across his face, the specific expression of a person who has just heard exactly the right thing and needed a moment to let it land. No, he said, you're right. He went into his mother. Evelyn stood in the corridor alone and thought, quickly and very practically, about what this changed for Easter. Everything Margaret had intended to do, the public acknowledgement, the revelation, whatever she had been quietly planning in her sitting room in the days since the commissioner's visit, now had to happen differently. With Margaret present but stationary, without the kind of sustained, authoritative performance she had been capable of a month ago. It could still happen, but Evelyn would need to carry more of the weight of it than she had expected. She went back to work. She did not stop moving for the next 48 hours. She organized the household Easter preparations with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been running the practical details of her own survival for years and found the logistics of a gathering relatively manageable by comparison. She checked on Margaret every 2 hours. She coordinated with Ruth and Agnes. She finalized the documentation sequence with Nathaniel, what would be said, in what order, by whom, to ensure that when the moment came it arrived with the weight of complete, irrefutable truth rather than the appearance of a personal attack. She slept 4 hours each night. She did not allow herself to think beyond Easter morning. One task at a time, her father's rule, which she had added to the 3-minute rule without ever consciously adopting it. Easter morning arrived cold and bright, the way Colorado mornings in early spring tend to arrive with the aggressive cheerfulness of a season that hasn't fully committed yet but is making a strong argument for itself. The county families began arriving at 10. By 11 the hall was full. The Whitmores, the Fenwick, the Alcott, the Hargroves, the Pendletons, and a dozen other families whose names appeared in various degrees in the county's social architecture. 43 guests in total, which was the largest Easter gathering Ashford Hall had hosted since William Ashford's death 8 years ago. Everyone noticed that Margaret was seated rather than standing to receive. No one said anything about it, because one did not say anything about Margaret Ashford's health to her face unless one wished to experience the particular variety of social obliteration she excelled at. Nathaniel received the guests. He was composed and precise and exactly himself, not performing anything. Not managing anyone, simply present. Evelyn had told him 3 days ago to be exactly that. To let the day be what it was going to be, and trust that the truth was strong enough to hold without assistance. He had told her that trusting things to hold without assistance did not come naturally to him. She had said, practice. Evelyn herself was exactly where she was supposed to be: quiet, efficient, present at the margins of the gathering in the way that a seamstress who also supervised household details was appropriately present. No one spoke to her directly. Several people looked at her with the particular curiosity of people who had heard things through the county social network and were trying to reconcile what they'd heard with the composed, unremarkable woman carrying a small arrangement of Easter flowers to the centerpiece table. She was aware of every look. She returned none of them. Margaret sat at the head of the table for the Easter meal with the specific grandeur of a woman who intends to be grand if it kills her. Dr. Hale had told her to sit. She was sitting. She had made no promises about the quality of her presence. Evelyn sat 2 seats away, which was technically a presumption for a household employee, and which Margaret herself had arranged. The meal proceeded. It was almost halfway through the plates cleared after the first course, the second being served when it happened. A man named Gerald Whitmore, patriarch of the Whitmore family and secondary member of the original consortium, had been drinking steadily since his arrival. He was a man who did not handle uncertainty well, and the past 2 weeks had delivered a great deal of uncertainty to every family connected to the consortium. He had the flushed, careful look of a person who is very near the edge of their control and is angry at the thing pushing them toward it. He looked down the table at Evelyn. "I find it remarkable," he said, loudly enough that the table conversations nearest him stopped, "that a household servant is seated at the Easter table." The table went quiet the way tables go quiet when something has just been said that cannot be unsaid. Nathaniel's expression went very still. Evelyn did not move. Margaret set down her fork. "Gerald," said Mrs. Whitmore from beside her husband, her voice carrying the specifically anguished tone of a woman who has been managing her husband's worst impulses for 30 years and is losing the battle today. "No, I think it wants saying," Gerald continued. "The alcohol loosening whatever filter usually kept this version of him inside. We are here for Easter dinner at Ashford Hall, and there is a seamstress at the table, and nobody seems to find that worth remarking on. And I find that remarkable. I find a great many things about recent events at Ashford Hall remarkably irregular." He was not talking about the seating arrangement. Everyone at that table understood he was not talking about the seating arrangement. Nathaniel opened his mouth. "Mr. Whitmore." Everyone looked at the source of the voice. It was Evelyn. She had not raised it, had not sharpened it. It was the same voice she used for everything clear, even carrying without effort. "I understand," she said, "that the past 2 weeks have been unsettling for several families in this county, including yours. That is not something I take any satisfaction in." She paused. "But I want to be very clear about something. The federal inquiry that Commissioner Hartwell has opened is not irregular. It is the correct response to documented evidence of fraud that affected this county and this community for decades. The irregularity, Mr. Whitmore, was not the inquiry. The irregularity was what the inquiry is about." Gerald Whitmore's face went very red. "You have no standing. She has every standing." Margaret's voice. Not loud, not theatrical. The kind of voice that doesn't need to be loud because the room has already learned to pay attention to it. She was gripping the table edge with one hand, and Evelyn could see the effort it cost her to hold herself steady. But her voice was entirely hers, entirely the voice of the woman who had run his house for 40 years. "Evelyn Hartwell," Margaret said, looking down the table with the deliberate clarity of a woman who has decided to say something and will not be stopped, "is the granddaughter of Elias Hartwell, whose federal land grant in this county was fraudulently transferred in 1876 by a consortium that included Mr. Whitmore, your own father." She paused to let that land. "She is the daughter of Richard Hartwell, who spent 12 years as county clerk conducting himself with more integrity than anyone at this table can honestly claim to have extended to him. And she is whatever else she is, or becomes a woman of more genuine quality than most people in this room have had the recognize." The table was absolutely silent. Every fork down, every face still, the specific crystalline silence of 43 people understanding simultaneously that something irreversible has just been said. Gerald Whitmore said nothing, because there was nothing to say. His father's name had just been said clearly, in front of every family in the county. By Margaret Ashford, in her own dining room, with the particular tone that meant she was prepared to repeat it as many times as necessary. Nathaniel looked at his mother. Something crossed his face that was entirely private, the expression of a son watching his mother do something that cost her enormously, and that he will not forget. He looked at Evelyn. She was looking at Margaret, and her eyes were very bright. Not with tears, with something that had been waiting a very long time to finally have somewhere to be. Margaret turned her head and looked at Evelyn directly. "I owe you a great deal more than this," she said quietly. "Not for the table." "For no, ma'am," Evelyn said. "You owe my father this, and you just paid it." Margaret held her gaze for a long moment. Then, with enormous deliberateness, she picked up her fork. Around the table, one by one, people followed. The meal continued. But something had permanently shifted in the architecture of that room, and everyone sitting in it felt it, the specific, irreversible shift that happens when a truth gets said out loud in the right company by the right person. And there is simply no going back to the shape things had before. Gerald Whitmore left before dessert was served. His wife apologized to no one in particular and followed him. No one else left. Afterward, when the guests had moved to the parlors and the table was being cleared, Evelyn found a moment in the corridor, 30 seconds. Maybe 40, where she was completely alone. She stood with her back against the wall. She pressed the locket against her sternum. She thought about her father at his desk by lamplight. She thought about the 3-minute rule and how many times she had used it in this house. In cold rooms, in corridors, in moments when the weight of what she was carrying threatened to pull her under. She thought about the look on Margaret's face when she said, "You owe my father this," and the old woman had understood completely and had not flinched. She thought about a man who left books by doorframes and crouched in corridors to pick up curtains and sat in a federal commissioner's meeting with his family's crimes in front of him and chose, in real time, not to look away. She pressed the locket harder. 30 seconds. Then she straightened her spine the way she always did and went back into the hall. There was still one thing left to do, and it required her to be completely, entirely, unshakably herself. She found Nathaniel in the east hallway, away from the guests, standing at the window with his hands in his coat pockets. He heard her coming and turned. He looked at her face, which she knew showed more than she usually allowed, and he did not say anything immediately. He had learned, over months, that she sometimes needed the space of a sentence to arrive on her own. She arrived. "My father would have liked you," she said. He looked at her. "He would have left you books," she said, and asked whether you'd noticed the foundry passages. Something moved across his face. "I would have noticed," he said quietly. She looked at him. "I know," she said. "That's why I said it." The corridor was quiet around them. Behind them, through the parlor doors, the sound of the county gathering, continuing voices. The clink of cups, the ordinary social sounds of people at Easter. Going on, Nathaniel took one step toward her, not dramatic. Not a declaration. Just a man closing a distance that had been maintained for months at a cost neither of them had ever fully acknowledged. He held out his hand. She looked at it. Then she placed her hand in his. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. They stood in the east corridor of Ashford Hall on Easter morning, hand in hand, while the Colorado Spring pushed through the window glass, and the county moved around them, and the locket pressed warm against her ribs. And for the first time since she had stepped off that supply wagon in October, with a rope-tied suitcase and cracked boots and her dead father's documentation sewn into the lining, Evelyn Hartwell felt the specific, unfamiliar, almost frightening sensation of not having to carry everything alone. Holding his hand lasted exactly 47 seconds. Evelyn counted, not because she wanted to end it, but because she had spent so many months counting things, seconds of fear, minutes of patience, hours of work, that counting had become the way her mind marked moments that mattered. 47 seconds. Then she heard footsteps in the parlor moving toward the corridor door. And she stepped back, and he let her hand go without holding tighter, which told her everything she needed to know about who he was. Ruth appeared around the corner and stopped when she saw them. Looked at Nathaniel, looked at Evelyn, looked at the space between them that was technically correct but emotionally obvious. She said nothing, but her expression said volumes. And the volumes were warm. "Lady Margaret is asking for you," Ruth told Evelyn. "She says it isn't urgent, which means it's urgent." Evelyn went. Margaret was in the smaller sitting room adjacent to the parlor, away from the guests, sitting in the high-backed chair she preferred when her back was troubling her. Dr. Hale had told her she'd done enough for one morning. She had apparently interpreted that as meaning she should simply relocate rather than stop entirely. She looked at Evelyn when she came in and said, without preamble, "Sit down." Evelyn sat. "I am going to say something," Margaret said. "And I am only going to say it once, so I would appreciate your full attention." "You have it," Evelyn said. Margaret looked at her steadily. "I have spent 8 years protecting the reputation of a man who did not deserve the protection I gave him at the expense of people who did deserve it. I cannot recover those 8 years. I cannot give your father back the ending he deserved. I cannot undo what my silence cost him or cost you." She paused. "What I can do is make certain that the remainder of my time in this house and this county is spent differently. That is what I intend to do." Another pause. "I am telling you this not because I want your forgiveness. I am telling you because you deserve to know that I understand the full weight of what I failed to do, and that I am not treating this morning's dinner table conversation as adequate payment for it." Evelyn looked at her. She thought about what it cost a woman like Margaret Ashford to say those words. Not the public declaration at the table that had been authority, which Margaret wielded naturally. This was something else. This was a woman in a private room admitting, to the one person who had the most right to her accounting, that she had been wrong in ways that mattered and that she intended to be different. That cost considerably more than authority. "I don't need you to keep paying," Evelyn said quietly. "What you did this morning was enough. What you gave the commissioner was more than enough." She paused. "My father didn't need vindication from perfect people. He just needed the truth to be said out loud by someone the county would believe." Margaret absorbed this. "You are considerably more generous than I would be in your position," she said. "You haven't seen me at my least generous," Evelyn said. "I've had 12 years of practice at not being it in public." Something shifted in Margaret's expression, not quite a smile, but the closest thing to one Evelyn had seen from her. It lasted approximately 2 seconds. "My son," Margaret said, "is going to ask you a question in the not-too-distant future." Evelyn kept her face very composed. "I imagine he asks many questions. This will be a specific one," Margaret said. "I want you to know that when he does, he is not asking impulsively. He has been thinking about it since November." She paused. "I know this because he told me, which is itself remarkable, since Nathaniel tells me very little about his interior life as a general practice." Evelyn looked at her hands. "Lady Margaret, I am not asking you to answer me," Margaret said firmly. I am simply telling you that whatever answer you give him, I will completely. She met Evelyn's eyes, including the one that means you stay. The sitting room was very quiet. I came here to find justice for my father, Evelyn said carefully. I didn't come here for anything else. I know, Margaret said. That is, in fact, one of the things that makes you worth staying for. She straightened in her chair. Now go back to the guests. I need to rest, and I cannot rest while you're sitting here making me think. Evelyn stood. She moved toward the door. Miss Hartwell, Margaret said. She turned. Evelyn, Margaret said, using her given name for the first and only time. Your father raised a remarkable woman. I am sorry he did not live to see what she became. Evelyn pressed her lips together for 1 second. He knew, she said. He always knew. She left before either of them had to manage what came next. The afternoon passed in the particular suspended way of important days, both very fast and very slow, depending on which part of your attention you were using. The guests moved between the parlors and the gardens. Nathaniel managed the county families with the composed, exact social intelligence he brought to everything. Evelyn moved through the afternoon doing what she had done since October, being present, being correct, being the person in the room that things ran smoothly because of, even when no one was tracking whose hands were making that happen. It was Gerald Whitmore's wife who found her at 3 o'clock. Not Gerald. He had left before dessert and had not returned. But Eleanor Whitmore came to find Evelyn in the hallway near the linen room, alone, and she stood in front of her with the particular posture of a woman who has made a decision that is costing her something. Miss Hartwell, she said, I want to apologize. Evelyn looked at her carefully. Eleanor Whitmore was in her 60s. She had the look of a woman who had spent her life being someone's wife rather than her own person, and who had made her peace with that, and who still, occasionally, had moments of her own that surprised her. My husband, what he said at dinner, Eleanor continued. I could not stop him. But I want you to know that his opinion is not mine. She paused. I remember your father. I was a younger woman when it happened. I thought at the time that something was wrong with the way it was handled. I said nothing. She looked at Evelyn steadily. I have thought about that silence for years. Evelyn looked at her. Mrs. Whitmore, she said carefully, your husband is going to have decisions to make in the coming months about the federal inquiry. Some of those decisions may involve what his family knew and when they knew it. Those decisions will affect you. She paused. When those moments come, I hope you'll remember that saying something. Even when it cost you matters. My father knew that. It cost him everything, but he was right. Eleanor stared at her. You're not angry, she said, as if she had expected anger and was genuinely uncertain what to do with its absence. I'm very angry, Evelyn said quietly. I've been angry for 12 years. But I've learned that anger is useful for finding the truth and useless for making people change. So I use it for the first thing and try not to waste it on the second. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, You are nothing like what I expected. Most people say that, Evelyn said. I've stopped being surprised by it. Eleanor left. Evelyn stood in the hallway alone for a moment, and she thought about what her father would have made of Eleanor Whitmore, a woman who had known something was wrong and said nothing for 30 years, coming to apologize to the daughter of the man she'd failed. He would have been gracious, she decided. He had always been gracious. It was one of the things that had made him so easy to destroy and so impossible to discredit completely. She was still standing there when she heard the front door. A new arrival. Late for Easter dinner, which was unusual enough to register. She moved toward the main hall and stopped, the man standing in the entrance handing his coat to Thomas. Looking around with the sharp, purposeful expression of someone who had come with an intention was someone she recognized. She had never met him, but she recognized him from the photograph her father had kept in his desk drawer in the last years of his life. A photograph of two young men standing outside a county courthouse, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at whoever was holding the camera. her father at 32, and his oldest friend Daniel Croft, who had been a lawyer in Denver for the past 20 years. She walked toward him. He saw her and stopped. He looked at her face, her father's face, which everyone had always said she carried, and something happened in his expression that she recognized, because she had felt it herself many times, the simultaneous arrival of grief and relief in the same moment, the two of them occupying the same space in the chest, neither willing to wait for the other. "Miss Hartwell," he said. "Mr. Croft," she said. "I was in Denver when I heard Hartwell had opened the inquiry," he said. His voice was not quite steady. "I took the first train I could." "How did you know I was here?" she asked. "Your father told me," he said, "before he died. He told me that if anything ever happened, if someone ever picked up the thread he'd been pulling, they would most likely end up in Harrowfield County. And that if they did, I should find them." He paused. "He didn't know it would be you." Evelyn stood very still. "He knew you might come here," she said quietly. "He knew the trail led here. He knew," Daniel Croft said. "He just ran out of time to follow it." She looked at this man who had been her father's oldest friend, who had driven from Denver on Easter weekend because he had made a promise to a man 12 years ago. "He told me something else," Croft said. He reached into his coat and produced an envelope, old, the paper slightly yellowed, sealed with wax that had been pressed with the Hartwell seal she recognized from the locket. He held it out to her. Her name was on the front, in her father's handwriting. She stared at it. "He wrote it the year before he died," Croft said quietly. "He gave it to me and said his exact words, 'Give this to Evelyn when the job is done.' Not before. She'll know when." Her hands were not steady when she took it. She did not open it, not here. Not in the main hall of Ashford Hall with 43 Easter guests behind her and a man she'd never met watching her face. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was barely a sound. "He was the best man I ever knew," Croft said simply. "And he was right about everything. It just took the rest of us too long to say so." She pressed the envelope against her chest beside the locket. She introduced Croft to Nathaniel 10 minutes later. The two men shook hands, and something passed between them in the handshake, the specific recognition of two people who are both trying, in different ways, to make right what was broken, and Nathaniel invited Croft to stay for the remainder of the afternoon without hesitation. Evelyn excused herself. She went to the east wing, to her narrow cot in the cold room. She sat down and held the envelope in both hands for a long time before she broke the seal. The letter inside was 4 pages in her father's careful handwriting. She recognized the quality of it, the particular precision he used for things that mattered. Every letter formed completely, nothing rushed, as if he had known these words needed to survive being read many times. She read it. She will not repeat what it said. Some things belong only to the people they are written for. But she can say this: her father had known, in the last year of his life, that he would not finish what he had started. He had written the letter because he needed her to know that he was not afraid of that. That he had spent 12 years doing what he believed was right. And that, whatever happened afterward, was not a failure, it was a relay. He was handing her the baton, not because he was giving up, but because he trusted her more than he trusted anyone else on earth to carry it across the line. He had written, "You are the bravest person I have ever known. And I have known you since before you could walk. Whatever room you walk into, Evelyn, you change the air in it. You always have. I need you to believe that about yourself, not because I say so, but because I have watched it be true your entire life." She sat on the narrow cot with the letter in her hands, and the locket pressed against her ribs and the Colorado Spring pressing against the window glass. And she allowed herself something she had not allowed since she arrived at Ashford Hall. Not 3 minutes, more than 3 minutes. She allowed herself to miss him completely. Without management, without the discipline of counting seconds, without the practiced composure that had kept her functional and forward-facing for 12 years. She allowed herself to just be his daughter, missing her father. On Easter morning, when she came back to herself, the light through the window had changed. She folded the letter carefully. She tucked it inside the cloth pouch with the locket. She sat for one more moment with both hands pressed flat on her knees. Then she stood up. She had one thing left to do. Nathaniel was in the library when she found him alone. The guests having moved to other rooms, standing at the east window with a cup of coffee that had gone cold in his hand. He turned when she came in. He saw her face not tear-streaked, because she had composed herself, but different in a way that he had learned to read, and he set the coffee down. "Your father's friend," he said. Yes. He waited. "He knew I'd come here," she said. "My father. He knew the evidence trail led to Ashford Hall. He wrote the letter a year before he died and told Daniel to give it to me when the job was done." She paused. "He knew I'd finish it." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "He was right," he said. "He usually was," she said. It made being his daughter equal parts inspiring and exhausting. Something moved in his face, not quite a smile, but warm in the same way. She looked at him. "I want to ask you something," she said. "And I need you to answer me honestly, not generously." "Honestly." "All right," he said. "The land claim," she said. "The Hartwell grant. If it holds and Hartwell believes it will, I have a property interest in this county. A real one. 340 acres adjacent to Ashford land." She held his gaze. "That changes the way people see everything. My reason for coming here." "My relationship with your family." "Yes," he said. "It does. There will be people who say I knew all along," she said. "That the whole thing my father's documentation. Coming here, the commissioner, everything was about the land." "Yes," he said. "There will be people who say that. And I need you to tell me honestly," she said, "whether any part of you believes it." He looked at her for a long, straight moment. "No," he said, "not for a single second." She held his gaze. "How can you be certain?" "Because I have watched you every day since October," he said. "I have watched you refuse money to leave. I have watched you be humiliated in corridors and at dinner tables and in rooms full of people who should have known better. And I have watched you conduct yourself with more dignity than anyone in this county has treated you with. I have watched you work in a cold sewing room by lamplight for $6 a month when you could have weaponized what you knew the moment you arrived." He paused. "A woman who came here for the land would have used what she had far sooner. Far harder and far less carefully than you used it." He looked at her steadily. "You came here for your father. I knew that the first time you said his coat deserved to last." She felt the specific sensation of being entirely, accurately seen. It was still unfamiliar. She was getting used to it. "I'm going to accept the land claim," she said quietly. "If it holds, I'm going to take it. Not because I need it, but because it belonged to my grandfather and it was stolen, and accepting it back is the last thing that needs to be made right." "Good," he said. "It will be complicated," she said. "The legal process. The county reaction. People will talk for a long time." "They will," he agreed. "I'm not leaving Harrowfield," she said. "I want to be clear about that. Whatever happens, I'm not leaving." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm glad." She looked at him. "I'm not going to make this simple for you," she said. "I'm going to be difficult and independent, and I'm going to have opinions about everything, and I'm going to argue with you when I think you're wrong. Which will probably be regularly. I'm counting on it," he said. "I've been surrounded by people who agree with me my entire life. It's been remarkably unhelpful. And I cannot be a seamstress here," she said. "If the land claim holds, I cannot stay in the servants' quarters and mend curtains. I won't pretend to be something I've grown past. I wasn't planning to ask you to," he said. She looked at him. "What were you planning to ask me?" she said. He took a step toward her, not dramatic, not performed. Just a man moving toward a woman he had decided very completely was the only person he wanted to be moving toward. "I was planning," he said quietly, "to ask whether you'd be willing to stop carrying everything alone." She looked at him for a long moment. All the months of it were in that look, the cold rooms and the counted seconds, and the needle moving through fabric at midnight, and the documents sewn into suitcase linings, and the 3-minute rule, and the locket, and the letter, and 12 years of a daughter carrying what her father couldn't finish. All of it. That, she said, is a considerably harder question than it sounds. I know, he said. I'm asking anyway. She reached into the cloth pouch at her side and took out the locket. Held it for a moment in her palm, feeling the weight of it, the real weight, which was not gold, but everything the gold stood for. Then she looked at Nathaniel Ashford, and she made the decision she had been making. Without quite admitting it, since the first morning he crouched by a doorframe with a book about Italian foundry work and looked at her with the specific attention of a man who was not seeing a category. Yes, she said. Simple completely meant. He exhaled a long, quiet breath as if he had been holding it for months, which she suspected he had. He reached out and took her hand again. Not 47 seconds this time. They stood in the library at Ashford Hall on Easter afternoon. And the Colorado spring came through the windows, and the county moved through the house behind them, and the locket was warm in her palm between their joined hands. And neither of them moved for a very long time. The Easter gathering ended at sundown. The county families left in their carriages, one by one, carrying with them the things they had brought and the things they had been given that afternoon, that they hadn't expected, truth being the heaviest of those, and the most inconvenient, and the most necessary. Gerald Whitmore did not return. His family would spend the next several months navigating the federal inquiry with the particular anxiety of people who have spent years assuming it made them untouchable and are discovering it does not. 3 families retained lawyers in Denver before the week was out. 2 families came forward voluntarily with corroborating documents before the federal inquiry formally requested them. The Alcott family, whose name appeared in the additional 1,877 transfers Hartwell had found, settled directly with the federal office in May. Commissioner Hartwell's inquiry took 14 months to complete. His final report ran to 240 pages. The Hartwell land grant was formally restored in March of the following year. 340 acres, Eastern County Territory, returned to its legal heir under federal authority. The county deed was recorded in the name of Evelyn Hartwell. Daniel Croft handled the legal proceedings. He came back to Harrowfield for the signing and shook Evelyn's hand afterward and said, "Your father is very loud about being right, wherever he is," and she laughed, actually laughed. The kind that comes from somewhere real, and said, "He always was." Margaret Ashford recovered fully by May. She never again mentioned the 8 years she had spent being a coward. She spent the subsequent years being the opposite, with the specific intensity of a woman who has something to make up for and intends to make it up completely. She was difficult and demanding and frequently exhausting. She was also, when it counted, absolutely steadfast. She and Evelyn developed a relationship that did not have a simple name, not friendship exactly. Not family yet, though it moved in that direction, but that was characterized, on both sides, by the particular respect of 2 people who have been honest with each other at great cost, and found that the honesty held. Ruth cried when Evelyn moved out of the East servants' quarters. "Happy to," she insisted, loudly and repeatedly, while crying. Agnes said, "I told you it wouldn't stay simple," and then admitted she was glad it hadn't. Victoria Caldwell's family navigated the federal inquiry through their Denver lawyers and emerged damaged but not destroyed, which was approximately what they had earned. Victoria herself left Colorado entirely in the summer and was reported to be in San Francisco. Evelyn heard this through the county network and thought, "Good," not with triumph, with the genuine, uncomplicated feeling of a woman who has no desire to see anyone destroyed and some desire to never see certain people again. Nathaniel asked his specific question in the East Library. On a Tuesday evening, in the ordinary lamplight, without any ceremony except the ceremony of meaning it completely. She said yes. Not because of the land, not because of the house. Not because of the county or the name or any of the things that the world used to measure the worth of a match between 2 people. Because he had left books by a doorframe and asked her what she thought about the foundry passages, and crouched beside her in a corridor to pick up curtains and sat in a room with his family's crimes in front of him, and chosen, without hesitation, to look. Because he had told her the truth was more important than the comfortable version of his family's legacy. And then proved he meant it. Because he had asked her to stop carrying everything alone, and then waited patiently. Completely, without pressure for her to decide, she was ready to believe that someone else could help carry it. They were married in September. The county came because the county always comes. And because things had shifted enough in 14 months that coming meant something different than it would have meant the previous Easter. Not everyone who came was genuinely glad, but enough were that it mattered. Margaret sat in the front row and was entirely composed for the entire ceremony, which everyone who knew her understood to be its own form of extraordinary effort on her behalf. Daniel Croft walked Evelyn in, because there was no one else and because her father would have chosen him. Evelyn wore a dress she had made herself, not because she had to, because she wanted to, because her hands had made things that lasted her whole life and she saw no reason to stop now. At the reception, Nathaniel's attorney told Evelyn that the county land registry had received 3 additional families, requesting voluntary review of their 1870s transfer records in the past month. The inquiry, it turned out, had done what federal inquiries sometimes do when conducted by people who are not afraid of what they'll find. It had made honesty feel safer than the alternative. And people were quietly choosing it. She thought of her father at his desk. She thought, you won. It just took longer than you should have had to wait. She pressed the locket against her ribs and stood in the light of her own September wedding and let that be enough. She had spent her whole adult life following a thread her father had pulled. She had followed it through grief and cold rooms and counted seconds and corridors where people looked through her and rooms where people looked at her wrong and one library where a man had looked at her exactly right. She had followed it all the way to here, and here, she had learned, was not the end of anything. It was the thing her father had always known it would be. If someone brave enough followed the thread far enough to find it. It was the beginning. Some truths take a long time to reach the light. But they do not diminish in the dark. They wait patient and exact. For the person with the right combination of courage and stubbornness and love to carry them the last necessary distance home. Richard Hartwell had known that. He had raised a daughter who proved it. And on a September afternoon in Harrowfield County, Colorado, with the locket warm against her heart and her hand, in the hand of a man who had chosen truth over comfort and justice over convenience, and her over everything that would have been easier, Evelyn Hartwell closed the distance her father had not been able to cross. She brought him home.